moment and talk about some ideas that have really impacted our industry in the past few years: community psychology, the psychology of fear, and perceptions of security and safety. We kind of have to start with the beginning, don't we? What is fear? Well, according to evolutionary theorists, fear is a protective instinct that really is based upon the idea of preserving ourselves and avoiding whatever the harm is. And this is good for both us as individuals and as groups. For our purposes, it's going to be an emotional reaction to physical or psychological stimuli. Essentially, it's a perception, right? And as Pattinson notes, within sports performance, it's often associated with negativity. For example, there's a fear of failure or fear of letting others down, those types of things. Fear, however, is not the same as anxiety. Over on the left-hand side of the slide, you'll be able to see what we talked about previously with fear. But on the right side of the screen, you'll be able to see anxiety. And anxiety is associated with stress. Remember, there are two forms of stress: distress and eustress. Distress is the real negative stress, and that's really what anxiety is associated with. It tends to be longer lasting, and it results in a feeling of being down. And so the example I give here is from Happy Valley. So if you think about the Penn State fans and the community, they were stunned, they were in shock, and they sort of experienced a general malaise in the wake of the Sandusky child sexual assault scandal. Whereas an example of fear might be something a little bit more in the moment, right? So it's going to be, let's say, associated with preserving your body. So if you are an athlete and you are in a high-risk situation, you might, for fear, a boxer, for example, you might hide behind your hands a little bit more because someone has a left hook or something like that that's really, really powerful. So difference between fear and anxiety, and at this point we were talking kind of about fear and whether it's an individual or an organizational, and that's going to be a little bit different in terms of how we engage with the concept of anxiety. Let's think about fear and the emotion and the emotional response and how that is going to be really processed by the individual. And again, whether you're talking about athletes or employees, that fear is going to kind of be dropped into three basic buckets. One is social approval, and that's letting folks down, right? Whether it's your parents, your teammates, your coworkers, whatever. The second bucket you're going to drop this fear into is perfectionism, right? And so it's the fear of failure, but it's fear of failure based upon these very high or increasingly heightened expectations. You have to be perfect or else you're going to have some sort of negative result. So maybe think of sometimes you would see this with youth sport athletes, and as their parents or guardians in the community are looking on, and maybe athletically they have some talent, and so the community or the family keeps raising the expectation, and so you have this idea of perfectionism that's going to be associated with fear for that particular individual youth sport athlete. The last bucket, if you will, would be negative social evaluation, and this is where you start thinking about how other people are going to see you. And it's not just seeing you in that moment, but seeing you and kind of thinking about your legacy. So maybe others are going to see you as a failure, someone who wasn't a pressure player. And what this can do is really lead to an individual employing negative coping mechanisms, right? So they're kind of dealing with that fact that so many people see them as a failure. We talk about negative social evaluation oftentimes with student athletes because you have these dueling identities that are oftentimes in conflict with one another. The student identity and the athletic identity oftentimes are going to conflict. So for example, if you have work that needs to be done for a particular class, that student identity sometimes is going to be set aside because the athletic identity has to take over based off of those obligations. So many people in a community, for example, see student athletes primarily as athletes. But what they don't realize is that student athlete, and we're sort of generally speaking here, okay, because there are thousands and millions of student athletes over the years. But when people see student athletes primarily as athletes and don't really take into consideration the student identity part, then oftentimes student athletes can be worried that if that student identity isn't sort of nurtured, then that becomes the source of failure. Well, what do I mean by that, right? So if a student athlete has trouble being eligible to participate in their sport, if it's a high-profile student athlete in a high-profile sport at a high-profile institution, that thing will show up on the bottom of ESPN on the little scroll there. It's going to be tweeted out, or it's going to be this and that. It becomes this big deal. And so now student athletes are having to cope with all these different things simultaneously for multiple identities, the student and the athletic identities. Okay, well, what about fear within the organization? And as someone who's trained and worked in organizations his entire career, I find this one to be really, really interesting, because the fear of organizational failure really causes a lot of organizations to create what we call, in organizational sociology, fantasy documents. All right, it's not fantasy in the sense that they're being malicious or these things are completely illogical or things like that, but oftentimes as an organization you're planning for these worst case scenarios, right? And that's really what these fantasy documents are. So if you have to develop evacuation plans or whatever it is within your organization or a facility, oftentimes you develop a worst case scenario and a resulting plan that intuitively your organization can handle, right? Which makes only sense, but that's also why it's called a fantasy document, because most of the time the worst case scenario truly is beyond the capacity of an organization to handle, right? So there is a fear of constituent retaliation or retribution. That's another thing that we have to kind of think about. And so this is a great example of looking at fantasy documents and kind of your peers. If you're thinking about Major League Baseball or the NBA or the NFL or something like that, and you're kind of basing what you do off of what you see around you. So the example here is that Major League Baseball and the NBA developed their respective domestic violence policies after the public's visceral reaction to the domestic violence epidemic that was going on within the NFL circa 2012, 13, 14, right around in there. Okay, so you had this very, very visceral reaction from the general public. It was very negative with everything that was going on in the NFL. And so to combat that, these organizations were monitoring social media, and they were engaging in what we call crowdsourcing, right? And crowdsourcing is when the organization is going to listen to ideas from individuals or people outside those organizations so that they can start to get a better sense for how the general public feels about these types of things. And you tend to do this because these technologies allow us to do this, and it's a great way to stay in connection with how people feel about certain issues. And then what you tend to do then is you develop your policies, for example, based off of that. Well, what the NFL had done was, they didn't necessarily have an explicit domestic violence policy, and so they had put together a policy that dealt with behavior and those types of things. And when they were planning kind of for worst case scenarios, they were thinking primarily about on-field behavior. Well, the worst case scenario in this particular instance was with off-field behavior, right? Another example, if you want to think about the NFL, and we're really not picking on the NFL here. These are just two fairly recent, high-profile examples that happen to involve the same organization. But the Washington football team and the general public's pressure to change the name, to change the mascot, to change the imagery. We see this actually with a lot of different organizations across a lot of different sports. So it's not just the NFL, not just the Washington football team, but this is when you're using crowdsourcing and you're trying to think about, as an organization, what fears do we have, but also how do we engage with the fears and the frustrations of a general public. These would be some methods that you would employ. Sport organizations, in regards to engaging or addressing fear, you essentially have a very, you know, a simple process of identify, address, and then try to engage in crisis management. Right? That's where we're trying to quell the constituents' fears there. In the past 20 years, just look at that wide variety. And I didn't even put on there kind of the previous example of domestic violence or interpersonal issues. Um, but we've got COVID-19, we've got Zika virus and the Olympics. We had acts of terrorism with the Boston Marathon bombing. We had interpersonal violence amongst fans. If you go back to the early 2000s in the Los Angeles Dodgers and the San Francisco Giants. And so as organizations are trying to deal with fear, that's when they create policies or try to create processes and protocols where they can decrease the fear of the stakeholders associated with their particular organizations or their particular sport. Up to this point, we've been talking a little bit about kind of organizations engaging with almost like external constituents in regards to fear. But I want to take a moment here just to talk about fear sort of within the organization. And this is kind of interesting because an organization is comprised of individuals and departments and all this kind of stuff. So sometimes it's hard to identify that, can a sport organization have fear, right? And to some extent, yes, because you're able to see how the organization as a collective entity is productive and moves forward. And one of the biggest things that sort of causes hesitancy or fear within an organizational setting is the idea of change, right? And I'm talking about, large, wide sweeping change. Change is the opposite of organizational missions and structure, because organizations were built primarily to be efficient. And to be efficient, you have to be able to predict what's going on tomorrow and the day after. So they're very stable entities, right? People have their own jobs that they do, and they do them very well. They're very specialized, and that's all predicated upon this idea of knowing what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do it. Change kind of upsets the apple cart, right? So innovation and transformation are inherently difficult and can result in organizational fear, according to Welburn, with the idea that as things are evolving in society, as things are evolving in terms of technology, that can create issues for not just the individuals in the organization, but the entire organization. Look at the example of broadcast rights agreements in terms of television, and then now you have the whole notion of streaming media, and that's difficult, right? And it takes time for organizations, whether you're cable stations or whether you're sport organizations, to adapt to that. As a result, there's going to be increased fear. And when you have increased fear or uneasiness within the organization, you tend to have, across the board, decreased productivity. Or as Drucker noted, every organization has to build the management of change into its structure. It is that important, to the point that these days we actually talk about change management as a skill set that you can develop. And it's a skill set that's based largely on the idea of being flexible. It's also based on the idea that, yes, you're flexible and you're nimble, but you have to connect with the foundational elements of your organization, your core values, your mission, your vision, right? Those things aren't going to change. And when the environment around you is starting to change, then organizations need to fall back on those ideas, because as a very large organization, you need to have something that sort of grounds you in consistency and productivity. And that's what those ideas, the mission, the vision, the core values, that's what they're designed to do, is provide a sense of stability when everything around you is changing and in flux. All right, so we've been engaging with this idea of fear. And so I just want to take a moment to talk a little bit about safety and security. They're kind of tangentially related to this idea, right? Now, safety and security are not the same thing. They're usually associated with our sporting industry context when we're discussing fear. But safety is going to really be that it's a a state of being where you are free from danger, you feel protected from harm. Okay, security are going to be the tangible processes and protocols that are going to be involved in really protecting everything. And you're going to be protecting people and organizations from whether it's the internal or the external threats. So here's the example of safety and security in the United States post 9/11, right? The U.S. Department of Homeland Security actually identified sporting events as possible terrorist targets in the wake of 9/11. So we saw an increase. In security processes and procedures, and you do that for a couple of reasons. One, because you want people to be safe, but you also want to create a sense of safety, right? There are those distinct psychological connections between safety and how we understand our community's needs, and we want to make sure that we're providing safety, which extends to the entire community, whether it's fans, maybe it's the geographical area around your facility. It doesn't necessarily matter. And remember, safety is really about being protected from harm, and harm can be physical or it can be emotional or psychological, right? So when you're going to create safety, you do that through security processes that try to address both of those things. So something really, really small, but really powerful that we've done here in the United States is if you look in large facilities, oftentimes you'll see like call-in hotlines, or you can kind of text a particular number if there's a fan, a fellow fan in a section that's either being belligerent or violent, something like that. And then you have a mechanism of how you can call the security personnel to come and remove that individual. And what they found was people felt safe simply because that sign and that information was there. There really is a security process involved in terms of removing those dysfunctional fans. But what really created the safety was the sense that security was there and needed if possible. And it was only a text or a phone call away. So that's really kind of how we're mediating the difference between physical and emotional or psychological safety. Community psychology, I think that's important. We tend to think of community psychology in terms of kind of community health and that sense of well-being, and the community tends to be a town or a neighborhood or something like that. But remember, what's really interesting about our world and industry of sport is that we create communities of fans, communities of sponsors, and things like that. And so community psychology really allows us to kind of look at the communities that we create within our world of sport and really kind of connect the social systems of how those individuals within those communities really relates to this larger whole. So they're focused on where the individual is going to act, behave, and emote, right? Emote involves emotions, but this is the verb of it, right? So it involves many emotional settings and environments. And for us, the sport, recreation, and physical activity organizations and situations create the opportunity for community. Great example. Think of in intercollegiate athletics, right? Think of the student section, quote unquote. And lots of times you have potentially hundreds, maybe thousands of students that may have never seen each other on a college campus before, but in that moment, they're a community. If you think about folks that are engaging in tailgating before particular sporting events, that's another great example of community. Or maybe you have in kind of the leisure and recreation section, you might have folks that are involved in physical fitness classes that come together and meet. They're individuals, but they come together and they engage in yoga, or they do different forms of group exercise classes. So the idea of community is really at the heart of what we do in sport, recreation, and physical activity. And once you are able to understand that community, then you're able to truly address what makes them feel better about safety and security, right? So think about, what constitutes a threat. You have the idea of maybe terrorism, but you also might have ideas of germs and viruses. You might have ideas of weather, right? If we're talking about on the West Coast and forest fires and how they impact communities physically, they can actually burn them up. but then they also create air quality issues. So, in terms of what is the threat, is constantly evolving and changing based upon our social environment and, truthfully, our physical environment. Finally, I just want to briefly talk about, we've talked about fear, and we talked about responses, and we talked about community. Well, in the world of sport management, um, sport managers have really documented and called for the idea of a responsibility to our community. Now, what is our community? That's going to vary based upon the organization, but DeCinci and Rosenberg actually take it a step further by actually identifying that, yes, we have a responsibility to better the lives of all the stakeholders involved within and outside of sport, with that latter part, outside of sport, being very, very important. This means that you all as sport managers are going to work in sport organizations that have a responsibility to your organizational personnel and the participants, which we get that. We have a, we have a responsibility to our spectators and the communities that are all involved with our events or our organizations. And then we have a responsibility to our partnering organizations, which can be more than just sponsors, right? There are a lot of organizations that are directly involved with sport organizations and what they do. If you think about, for example, the Kansas City Chiefs and a lot of the different community-based initiatives that they have. These are partnering organizations, right? You might have an official education provider for an MLS franchise. That's a partnering organization as well. And so we want to be mindful of that and be mindful of the fact that fear and community and responsibility really does involve not just our organizations, but also everything that's around our organization. And so if you kind of think about a sport is embedded in a community is embedded within, a larger community and perhaps even a state. Let's say that state is embedded within a region. Maybe that region is embedded with the country, and that country is embedded with a hemisphere, and then we're all part of this global sport community. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about a responsibility to community, whether it's sport or not sport. So as a result, I just thought I would kind of leave you with the following slide as a way to round out our discussion for this particular section. This is our vision in the Department of Sport Management, leading change in the world by leading change in sport.